Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Empowered Presence podcast. Today we have a special guest. I say it every week, but all of my guests are special. They're always so impressive with all these credentials. I love it. And Dr. Carol Parker Walsh is no different. Okay. She is here to talk to us about something we haven't talked about that much on the show. We're talking about the differences between the generations in a professional setting, in the workplace, in leadership, and how that all interacts with our personal brands, right? Communication styles, our own unique values. It all kind of has a trend as we talk about the different generations. So we're going to explore that today and talk a little bit about that. And I'm very, very, very interested with this about this conversation today. Let me talk to you a little bit about Dr. Carol Parker Walsh, shall we? So she is an expert in transformative leadership and human development, and has been recognized with multiple awards for her profound impact. Love that impact. As the CEO and founder of Carol Parker Walsh Consulting Group, her firm specializes in leadership development, executive coaching, and talent optimization. And she partners with leading organizations to cultivate a culture that accelerates leadership capabilities and drives future organizational success. Her extensive background is covers employment attorney, consultant, researcher, brand strategist, senior leader. I mean, what has this woman not done? She's been a TEDx speaker. She is an Amazon best-selling author. She's a member of the Forbes Coaches Council, Forbes Black, Newsweek Expert Forum, Entrepreneurs Leadership Network. She's a mentor to other young professionals. She's a fellow of the Harvard Institute of Coaching, keynote speaker, and a trusted career leadership expert on ABC's AM Northwest Morning Show. Like, can we take a moment? Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate you spending the time, carving out time to talk to me and be on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I know you have some exceptional guests. I'm a fan of the show, so it's nice to be here.
Yes. Did y'all hear that? She's a fan. My show. Love that. I appreciate you so much. And when you reached out, your team reached out, I was like, oh, I have arrived. So, yes, I love that. So let's get into this conversation, right? As you know, if you're a fan of the show, that I talk a lot about personal branding, both in the corporate space, but also in entrepreneurial space, right? And so again, one thing we haven't really dissected is this dynamic of the different generations. So, one, I would love to know more about your take on why this is important, right? An
Mhm.
important conversation, because I've noticed some things, some differences, and things like that. We'll dive into that. But tell me why you feel like this needs to be discussed on a platform like this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been studying generational differences and generational diversity for about 20 years. And the last time it was a really big thing was around 9/11, actually. It emerged as a very popular and interesting conversation that people wanted to have because we started seeing this emergence of these different generations that were a big turning that was happening at the time. And now we're seeing another, if you will, called turning. And this is a term or phrase that William Howe uses in his work. He has a book actually called The Fourth Turning, and where we're seeing the millennials being the largest population in the workforce. We're seeing Gen Z enter the workforce pretty predominantly, and even Gen Alpha that are, starting to come of age a little bit. So, this is a very interesting time because boomers are retiring. I mean, about 10,000 boomers a day are eligible for retirement. So we're seeing them move out of the generation. Gen Z step into the leadership. Actually, most CEOs and organizations are Gen Z leaders, as opposed to boomer leaders that we used to see. So we're seeing this kind of turning and shift in population in the workplace that is right now causing a little havoc, if you will.
Mm.
Causing people to rethink how they think about work, right? We had the pandemic, that was another major event. And then we went into this remote work, this hybrid work. And so we're seeing a tension between what does it mean to be at work? What does that look like? And we see the generations kind of splitting over what that looks like. What does it mean to be professional at work? We see generations kind of splitting over what that means in the workplace. So we're seeing this kind of clash, if you will, of values and beliefs and what's called professionalism, if you will, in the workplace. So there's a lot that's taking place right now, which is why it is once again emerging as a hotbed topic within organizations.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? And I think the way we all grew up impacts how we view work and life in general, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, there's an interesting, if anyone likes to geek out on this stuff like I do, there is William Strauss and Neil Howe wrote a book called Generations way back in the 90s, and then wrote another book called The Fourth Turning. And what they did was they studied generations going all the way back to the 1500s. And what they found is that there are four kind of archetypes of generations that appear about every 80 to 100 years. And they're named something slightly different, except for the Civil War, because there was so much casualty during the Civil War that we actually skipped a generation. But there's always been these kind of four generations, which at the time for us had always been boomers, Xers, millennials, and then Gen Z. And so we see that when a new generation comes around, like for example, Gen Alpha, that is starting another turning. And so that typically that their experience will be similar, or their ideas and values will be very much akin to what we've seen in the boomer generation. So it's really interesting in terms of that work. But you're right, their philosophy is that the experiences at the time, the social mores, the culture, what's happening economically, what's happening socially, what's happening culturally are going to impact how generations grow up and how they express themselves in the workplace, right? So, we saw boomers, for example, grow up with a nuclear family and had these traditional work ethic and value and believed in loyalty. And, while they invented the 40-hour work week, actually they expanded it to the 80-hour work week. So most boomers believe in that overtime and coming in on the weekends and things of that nature. And then we saw Gen X, which is the smallest population, grow up at a time when divorce was on the rise, where birth control was introduced. So mothers were choosing not to have children or not to get married or to work in the workplace as opposed to being at home. So we saw this generation being more self-sufficient. So even though they followed in terms of this work ethic, they started seeing and understanding the value of work-life balance and don't want to just work all the time, but wanted to have a good balance between the two. And so we saw this generation introduce that concept of work-life balance, that, you work hard, but you also play hard, if you will. And then we see the millennials come in that, started to express this. They started coming into the digital age a little bit. They grew up with the internet. They start having smartphones and, all of these other kind of technical things that were coming about. But they valued, kind of mentorship and community and collaboration and support and being able to work together as a team and to support each other and lift each other. They kind of brought into the conversation this idea of authenticity and being really real and not having to kind of follow in their parents or the generation before its footsteps, but really kind of marking their own path, and became a very large generation. And then now we have Gen Z, that is a complete digital native. It's the first generation that was born completely in the 21st century. It's the first generation that was born completely in the midst of social media, the internet, technology. So while millennials were adapting to it or were alive as this was coming about, this generation is in the midst of it at its height. And so this is a generation that's been overexposed with media and information. But because of that, they have a global idea of community. They believe in diversity and inclusion. It's not just a buzzword, it's something that means something to them. They're challenging gender identity and gender politics, that, there's no one way of doing things, right? They're speaking of being non-binary and different pronouns. And so they're introducing a whole nother way of being in the world that is very foreign to the older generations as well, right? But this generation also thrives with authenticity and realness, and they want you to be transparent and open and to walk your talk. So if you are inauthentic or not being real, they are not afraid to express their opinions. They're not afraid to express their feelings, and will call you out in a moment if you don't do it. And they are very much not into work-life balance. They're into life, and they work to support an enjoyable life that they want to have. And it's not the other way around, which can be challenging in the workplace. But the thing that I want to say, even though that I've generalized quite a bit about generations, I want to caveat to say not everyone is the same. So even though we tend to talk about generations and these generalities, everyone is different because, as I said, it's not only the economic and social influences of the time and technology of the time, but it's also very personal. It's how you grew up in your family. It's what your cultural or racial or ethnic background may have taught you in your household that may be very, very different. You could have been raised by an older parent or grandparents that instilled a different work ethic and value in you than if you were raised by maybe a younger parent. So there's also a lot of nuances that are in between generations. So I always often caution people to not just assume because someone was born in a particular time frame that they're going to exhibit certain traits or personalities because they should represent that generation. So I just like to caveat with people that, first of all, do not genericize them. Do not think that they're all alike. The other thing, no one generation is better than the other. And I know we like to play that game.
Beg to differ. I beg to differ. Wait a minute.
Yeah, right. See, I know we like to play that game, but every generation has something of value to contribute. Every generation has something that, because of their experiences and their background and what they know and what they have brought to the table, offers something of value. So no one is better than the other, but also, most importantly, definitely don't genericize them. There are some traits that we can maybe attribute because they grew up in that time. There's another author called Jean Twenge that recently wrote a book called Generations, and her perspective is that technology impacts the differences between generations. So, depending on whether you grew up with a washer and dryer, whether you grew up with a laptop in your house, that also may inform how you experience and show up in the world. So there's a lot of nuances to it that I want to say, but I think for purposes of these conversations, it's kind of interesting and fun to, capsulize these generations in those kind of categories, so that we can speak with some kind of clarity around, what to think about when you're working with generations. But always, I caution everyone to always be curious and to ask questions and not to make assumptions when you're working, across generations.
Yes. Thank you for that breakdown. Love
Yeah.
that. Yeah. And I have so many thoughts as you were talking. I was jotting down things like, yes, that's a good point. That's a good point. Like we should explore that. So there's just so much here. And so I guess the one thing I want to talk a little bit about is from my own generation. Millennials. And I know you claim that's not a best, but we could table that for now. But right, when you talked about millennials, you talked about them being kind of the rise of authenticity and kind of breaking away from those typical, what it was, those traditions and that type of thing. And I feel I really resonated with that because growing up, I was going to be a doctor or a lawyer. That was like pretty much my options in my household. And I grew up and I'm like, I don't want to do any of that. What else can I do? Right. So I had to like find my own way. And I
Hmm.
think that, prior to that, traditionally, like you said, generally speaking, it was kind of already laid out. The pipeline was already set up. You go here,
Yes.
you go to school, go to college, you get a degree, you get a good job, you work for your life, you retire. And that
Yes.
worked, but that worked for the boomer generation. Their
Yes.
hard work paid off. Like, they were able to retire and had their pensions and 401ks or retirement plans and all of that. But we saw the breakdown of that, and
Mhm.
we no longer really believed in it because we saw that it didn't really work anymore. And I think a part of that, it definitely influenced me personally. Let me speak for myself, right? So for me, it influenced me in saying, this model doesn't work. That's not going to pay off. In the meantime, I'm not going to be able to enjoy life. I want to do what I want to do, and I want to enjoy whatever it is I'm doing. And
Yes.
so I think that that's definitely something that resonated with me as you were speaking about the different generations and how they approach work.
Yeah, that's 100%. Millennials are purpose driven. You all introduced this idea that I want to love what I do. I want to make an impact in the world, right? I want to be purpose driven in my work. Whereas boomers, coming off of silent generation, parents, and even to some extent Gen Xers, were raised with that blueprint of you go to school, you get a job, you stay there until you retire. But that was during a time also when companies kept you until you retired. Around the 80s, when we had that first kind of recession and massive layoffs that were happening, it was disillusioning for a lot of Xers because they saw that, well, I'm supposed to work here until I retire, but companies were laying people off. And that was the beginning of this idea that this loyalty to companies started shifting and that you can't depend on a company to stay there forever, right? To be there until you retire, even though that's the mantra that you were raised with. So a lot of people, as I said, as you were saying, this younger generation started seeing that, is that really going to pay off for them? In addition to the fact, millennials watch their parents work themselves to death. They weren't there for the basketball games. They weren't there for practice. They weren't there to watch their kids win an award. On family vacations, they were on the phone working all the time. So they weren't available. And what the millennial generation kind of watched their parents do is just not be there. Yes, they worked. Yes, maybe they provided. Yes, they had the income that was there. Yes, maybe they were able to afford the lifestyle that afforded them the opportunities to go to a great school or do certain things, but the parent was absent. And as millennials watch this growing up, they were like, that's not living, what's it? And on top of it, they watch that boomer come home and complain about their job. Right? They weren't necessarily happy. They didn't love what they did. It was just a job. It was there for a reason. And so not only were they giving so much time to it, they weren't necessarily enthralled or happy or excited about what they were doing. Now you had the occasional one that loved their work and was really well into their work. But if you come under this idea that you just work to live, right? You just work that job so that you can have an opportunity to do certain things in life as opposed, and I'm sorry, backwards, they live to work, right? So their whole thing was about working, having that good job and being able to support their family. And it didn't matter if they enjoyed it. It didn't matter if it was fulfilling. It didn't matter if it was purpose driven. It didn't matter if it matched, their passions or what they would love to do in the world, even what they were good at doing in the world. It just paid the bills and provided for the family. And so when your generation was kind of watching that, you were like, "No, thank you." You
Yeah.
There's gotta be a different way. And even though you were taught the blueprint, like, I hate to date myself, but I mean, I have millennial kids. Even though they saw that blueprint, I was a little bit different. This is why I always say, watch how you categorize people because I've always been purpose driven. Even though I grew up as a boomer, I've always been purpose driven and followed my passion and would change and shift my career based on something that would really advance things that I love to do and the impact that I wanted to make in the world. And so I was an oddity, and that was a hard way to be when I was coming up because it was seen as flighty or not clear about what I wanted to do or
Rebellious.
lacking. Oh my goodness, yes, exactly. So at the time that I was doing this in the 90s, the 80s, 90s, and even the 2000s, it was just looked upon as odd versus now where it's looked upon as very, very normal. So luckily I try to instill that in my own kids. But they've seen other, their other parents and other people around them, do this, like, I have this job and I work, and they're like, no, I don't want any of that. I want to
Mm.
really love what I do because I want to love my life.
So let's get into a little bit of like what this all plays out, how this all plays out at work in
Yeah.
leadership, right? So here
Mhm.
we are, right? Let's say I'm a boomer. I not interested in doing things for impact or passion. I'm here to get my check. I'm going to follow the rules and I expect all of you to do the same. How do you how do you, deal with that as the leader with this, right? Because
Mhm.
now your team is rebelling. They're a little resentful. They probably don't stay. There's a lot of things that could come from that. And then how do the younger generation handle a leader like that? How can we make this all work in the
Yeah,
workplace?
yeah. Well, I, do this work with a lot of older leaders who are struggling with, why aren't my younger staff acting like me? Which is
Mm.
basically, a summation of what I hear. And what I often approach and take a step back is to talk about, what does it mean to be a leader, right? And the first thing to understand is that a leader isn't someone who just kind of barks orders, or a leader's not someone who's trying to create little mini me's. What a leader does is to foster the best in the people that are working with them, right? Your job as a leader is to help others shine as their authentic and best versions of themselves, right? And so if you can understand and adapt that as a way of being a leader, then it first of all opens you up to the possibility that everyone is not going to learn like you, operate like you, work like you, etc. Right? And so it forces you as a leader to take a step back and say, how can I get to know this other person? How can I understand their strengths, their abilities, their visions, their goals, and foster an environment that allows those things to flourish as much as possible. So the first thing to do is to kind of really redefine your idea of what it means to be a leader. And then that'll help you approach it very differently. But what I say to my older, to my boomers or even my Xers who are in leadership and they're working with a younger generation, is to first of all understand the generational differences. We talked about that a little earlier. What's different about those generations? What are their experiences that are not your experiences? Right? One example I remember was somebody was really frustrated because a younger generation, somebody on their team was struggling trying to figure out how to work the copy machine in the office. Right? Now, that seems quite simple, but what I had to explain is that a younger generation, they don't deal with copy machines. Everything's digital. Everything is, either email. There's no fax machines, there's no copy machines in their world. Everything is very digital. And so they're very quick to be able to send you something that way, but to ask them to go and deal with this massive copier that you have in your office that they probably have never seen or dealt with in their life, you can't be frustrated because they don't know how to handle that. There's no copy machine class that they had to take, right? Nor is there any experience around it, right? And that's actually something that in the end may ultimately become obsolete. So, and I know that's a small example, but it felt very frustrated because the leader thought that's just common sense. Well, but if that's not your experience, it's not going to be common sense. It's not going to be commonplace. So we have to kind of take a step back and understand what's different about their experiences in these generations that may show up in the workplace that I may not be familiar with or I may not understand. So the first thing to do is just ask questions, get to know them, right?
Well, I also think, let me
Yeah,
interrupt real quick because I want to add something to that. There's a nuance there where if you are aware and you understand, I think sometimes there's also a lack of respect for that experience. And it's kind of like, well, they don't want to work. And then disregarding their experiences as, less than or not good enough or, right. And so I think also adding to that, yes, learn and understand, but also respect and honor kind of
yeah.
those differences at the same time and not disregard them. because they're not yours. I think
Yeah,
that's where the
absolutely.
issue comes into place, right?
Yeah, I always tell every generation that the generation before you struggled with you too. That, the generation before you thought you were, uncouth and crazy and not with the times, right? So silent generations have problems with boomers. Boomers have problems like every generation before it, before you were struggling a little bit. So, you have to kind of be a little bit more empathetic and understanding that just like you had to explain to your older generation when you were coming up, you have to have the same level of empathy for this other generation that is trying to, find its way and find its place in the workplace. And the same type of empathy and understanding and, being able to have adaptable communication skills is so important,
Mhm.
right? And the way to do that is by having active listening, asking questions. I always tell people the greatest skill you can have is curiosity. If you
Mm,
can just be patient and ask questions and get to know and understand, then you can adapt your leadership. You can adapt your communication in a way that will be supportive to the person that you're working with, regardless. Because you may actually work with somebody in your own generation who may be like similar to me, who's different than what the standard typical person in my generation is, and struggle with that because you think we're on the same line or of the same thinking, and we're not. And we have to break away from this idea that because you're in my generation or you're in this generation, that this is the way you are. And again, those are those generalities that I talked about. So as a leader, you want to think about what it means to be a leader. You want to have empathy. You want to be authentic as your own leader. A lot of older leaders don't even know themselves.
mm,
They weren't brought up in an opportunity to really understand who am I and what matters to me, because that was not a question they were allowed to ask or answer as they came up. It didn't matter, right? All that mattered was that you delivered results and that you showed up to do the work. So for my older leaders, I always have them do a little bit of work of understanding what are their own values and passions and visions and things that matter to them, so that they can begin to start to explore that within the generations that they're actually working with. And then having adaptable communication, right? Not everyone wants to sit in a 5-hour meeting every Monday. That this is the beautiful thing about having a millennial or a Gen Z on your team, because they can actually support you in leveraging technology to be able to disseminate information and to have meetings online, or to be able to chat about things or problem solve in ways that can be much more conducive and quicker and easier. And that involves and includes your younger generation, as opposed to you trying to keep the same old going the way that you learn how to do it, and then believing that the other people have to learn how to do it in that exact way, right? If as a leader, you want to be paying attention to what the future of work looks like, and what it looks like is not what it used to be. Post pandemic, so much has changed. And so leaders have got to start being more students of what's happening in the world, in the workplace, so that they can be adaptable and keep their own relevancy as well. So those are the type of things that I suggest for my older generations. And then to definitely, like, reverse mentoring is something that's really valuable. Allow some of your younger generation to reverse mentor your older generation, to teach them, let them leverage their skills of tech savvy and collaboration and brevity and things of that nature, and let them mentor the older generations and teach them a few things, right? Because as you said earlier, there's value. Everyone brings something of value, and they should be respected and not looked upon as insignificant or unimportant because it's not something you know, or something that you have an experience with, or even aligns with your own value system.
yeah, yeah. I love that you brought that up, because I just see, especially what you said about how, a lot of these leaders haven't done that work to know who they are, right? And that trickles down. And if when you think about it, these are the people running the organizations, right? These are high up leaders, and that trickles down. So now they don't really necessarily value authenticity. And that I'm stuck on authenticity because that's one of my things, one of my topics, right? Because if the company and the leadership collectively, generally speaking, don't value authenticity, then the folks who are authentic, they don't feel like they can thrive there, and they feel
That's exactly
stifled,
right.
right? They feel
Yeah.
stifled.
And this is why, for example, your generation has this reputation that, well, they don't stay, right? That they leave every 2 to 3 years. So I'll hear sometimes, why invest? Because they won't stay, or they don't, they won't be here that long. And I always say it goes back to what you just said, is because the culture is one where they don't feel that they're valued, that they're welcomed, and that who they are is who they can be within the workplace. But if you create an environment where they feel valued, where you start embracing authenticity and empathy and adaptable communication as an example, where you have reverse mentoring, where you are supporting them and nurturing them and asking them questions about what they need to be successful in the workplace, where you're creating mentorship opportunities, where you're allowing them to see what the trajectory of their career could look like here, and that you're providing a place for them to thrive and flourish, they will stay. And the reason that they don't is because they don't feel that there's a place for them and they vote with their feet. So millennials and Gen Zs are not going to stay in a place where it's not authentic. They're not going to stay in a place where you espouse values on the website, but don't live them within the workplace. And if there's a mismatch in that, they are not even going to waste time there. They're going to move on and find a place that they feel that they can flourish and thrive in the workplace. And so you're exactly right. It comes down, but it's very hard to break old tried and true habits that it's all about work, right? Back in my day when you came to work, if you were sick or not feeling well or had a fight at home or whatever the case was, you left that at home, right? The idea was you leave all of yourself at home and you just bring that professional part of you to just work and deliver results and nothing else mattered. That's very different now when we're having conversations in the workplace about mental health, about having wellness days, about people feeling as if they just can't be their full self today. So they're not going to come in or they need to leave early, right? Or they're struggling with something and then having an opportunity to go speak to somebody that's designated at work for that so that they can have that support. To having flexible schedules, to having remote and hybrid work situations. All of these things have come about in order for people's personal lives to be melded and aligned with their work life so that they can have fullness in terms of what they do. And organizations that are struggling with that are going to have a hard time in terms of being having a sustainable, successful future organization because you're not going to have another generation of people to have that succession planning who are going to pick up and take on that generation to take on that work when you move on. So we want to make sure that we're fostering this next generation because they are the future of work. And we want to think about how can we not only instill the things that we've learned and know, but also adapt to what they're bringing to the table to create something even better moving forward. And that's the way you have to look at it. But you're right. That's the rub right there, is not wanting to let go of what I know, what I'm comfortable with, what makes sense for me, as opposed to how can I create something that makes sense for everybody else. But it also goes back to this idea that I said about what does it mean to be a leader, right? You're not just in charge, but you are the charge for the people in your group, if that makes sense, right? You're
Yeah,
not just in charge, but you're the one responsible for making sure that the people within your group are thriving and flourishing within the workplace.
I love that. I want to switch gears just a little bit, but before that, I do want to address a question that came into the comments as we're live here on LinkedIn. So, Yegs asked, what about the need to do work that excites them? A lot of it often is the routine and mundane. How do you motivate with more structured, repetitive tasks? Any thoughts around that? Very briefly.
Absolutely. It's not sometimes it's not just about the routine and the mundane. It's like, why are you doing it? Sometimes if there's something very fascinating about the story we tell ourselves about the work that we do. If you look at, for example, Japanese structures in terms of manufacturing, if you talk to anyone on the floor, like say they're building chips for computer, for a big laptop or something, there's one person that all they do day and night is to put the chip in this, put the chip in this. Like that's all they're doing on that manufacturing line. But if you ask them what they're doing, they don't tell you, oh, I just put chips in the machine. They tell you, I'm creating a piece of technology that's going to change someone's life. That's a very different story that you tell yourself about the work you do. So a lot of it comes with, why are you doing what you're doing? Do you know why you're doing what you're doing? Do you know the impact of what you're doing on the grander scheme, right? That this one thing you're doing that's routine, who is it impacting? How is it going to impact your customer, the end user, the world, your community, right? I mean, do you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it and the impact it's going to make? And sometimes just reframing that narrative around the work that you're doing can make an incredible change and not feeling like I'm just doing the routine, the repetitive, or the mundane. Because what I'm doing, if I don't do this work, this is going to be the end result, that someone's life is going to be impacted in a negative way if I don't do this work. So sometimes it just comes with that, right? Going back to the why. And if you've explored the why and you've examined that and changed that narrative and you're still not excited, then I would suggest you find what does excite you. Right? Maybe you're at a different, maybe you shouldn't be doing that repetitive task. Maybe you should be doing something else and you just found yourself into doing something that, as we talked about before, is paying the bills, or it's a good job and they have good benefits and we have things of that nature. That those are the tend to be the things we look more at than actually the work that we're doing and the impact that we want to make. And so that's what I would say about it.
Yeah,
Hopefully
I
that
like
answers your question.
I like that. I mean, it makes total sense, right? So, just switching over just a little bit, right? When it comes to branding, right? Branding yourself at work, building a professional brand and carrying yourself in a different way, in a certain way. I would love to hear your thoughts around the intersection between having that personal brand that's authentic to you and the definition of professionalism that you have versus what the company has, because sometimes that's not in alignment. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts around that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll tell you the way I think about it. Your brand by definition is your unique promise of value, right? So what is that for you? Is that someone who promises that they're going to show up and give their 100%, to the whatever they're doing? Does that mean that's gonna be someone who is going to be, empathetic and understanding? Does that mean that's someone who is going to look at the environment that's around them and ask themselves, "How could I be of the greater highest use?" Does that mean that I'm gonna be someone that, is gonna be known for supporting other people to achieve their goals and their dreams? Like, what does that mean to you? And how do you want people to experience and see you? Right? So that to me is like the foundation. If your unique promise of value, right, how you want people to see and experience you is through that lens, then that's how you show up. Now, if your organization has an idea of what it means to be professional, then you want to understand what that means and how that aligns to your unique promise of value, to how you want to be experienced and how you want people to see you and to know you, and look for those areas of alignment so that you can show up in the most powerful and authentic way. Now, if they're out of alignment, if the idea of professionalism in the workplace, or how they want you to show up is not in alignment, then that's going to be problematic and that may not be a place that you want to work. So I am not about trying to fit a round peg in a square hole. Right? So it's not about shifting and deconstructing who you are to fit into something else. It's about where are you seeing those points of alignment that allows you to show up in your true, authentic self, right? So that you're showing up, delivering your unique promise of value. Because if all of that of who you are in terms of your brand allows you to do the highest level of work, that organization wants you to deliver that highest level of work. And you want to let them know that here's what it takes for me to deliver the results that you're looking for in this organization. But if I can't bring all of that to the table, I'm not going to be able to function at the level that you want me to function at. And as a result, this may not be the place for me. Or here's what I'm going to need from this place in order for me to deliver at that highest level. So you have to understand what your unique promise of value is and what that is that you want to deliver. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there may not be levers of compromise, but compromise comes in where there's alignment with the values, right? If there's so out of alignment in terms of who you are and how you need to be, again, to deliver your highest level of work, that's going to be problematic. But there may be areas of negotiation that allows the organization to maybe open up and expand a little bit than maybe they even knew was possible so that you can be successful. So having those conversations and having the ability to, again, know who you are and know what you want to deliver and look for those areas where you can find alignment are going to be really, really powerful. So for me, professionalism, there's no one definition of that, right? I know in some places they may have a definition of that. And so you want to understand what that is to see if it does align with your own. But you want to understand, what does it mean for you to be professional? Because for some, it means like an old school way is that you show up, if you show up on time, you're late. So that means get there 10 minutes early. That means stay an hour late, be the last one that leaves the office, be the first one to volunteer for, any assignment that comes up, be the first one to stay over the weekend, take on more work than what's in your job description or on your plate, right? So for some people, that may be how they define professionalism. So you want to understand, is that true? Because if that's not my definition, you're not going to be happy. It's not going to work because you're not going to rise to the level of their understanding of what that means for you. So understand what it means for you to show up, understand what it means for you to deliver your unique promise of value and to deliver your best possible results within that organization. And if they're in alignment, that to me is what professionalism is.
Love that. I just love it. I appreciate that. Yes, ma'am. So listen, we're going to wrap it up. Is there anything else you wanted to share around the topic of conversation today as it relates to, leadership styles across the generations, personal branding, authenticity, anything you want to leave our audience with before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I would say when it comes to generational work, when it comes to purpose-driven work, when it comes to leadership, you need to be in a mindset of continual learning and development with this work. You need to not just be trained and developed by those who are similar to you or think like you, but really put yourself in situations and give yourself opportunities to work across generations, to be exposed to generations, and come at it from a position of learning and not just a position of knowing. Right? And that goes for every generation. Younger generations think they know more than the older ones, right? They think we're outdated and obsolete. And the same thing for older generations. They think the young ones have a lot to learn and they just don't know anything. So we have to let that go and come at it from a position of learning as opposed to a position of knowing. And that way you may gain some skills, you may gain some insights, you may gain some understanding that you otherwise would never have had, that may be able to uplevel your ability to be one of the greatest leaders within your organization that you never gave yourself an opportunity to have because you didn't give yourself those opportunities and that exposure to really learn and grow and expand, to really get all of the richness that every generation brings to the table.
Love that. Thank you so much. Tell the people how can they connect with you?
Yeah, well, the best way is to go to my website at www.carolparkerwalsh.com. And that's where you can learn more about me and how we support individuals and, the work that we do. I'm also show up a lot on LinkedIn. So, you can find me there on LinkedIn as well, to see things that I post or talk about related to generations and leadership and other things.
Awesome. Thank you again. This was such an enlightening conversation. You're a wealth of knowledge, as I already knew.
Well, thank you for having me. This is fun. I love this topic. So, yeah.
I can tell. I love that. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I definitely appreciate you. Okay, so the name of the podcast is Empowered Presence. Empowered is just the ability to do something, and presence is the state of existing. You already have the power. Just be who you are. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please just share this out, subscribe, leave a rating, leave a review. That's it. I'm not asking for anything else, right? Just show me a little love, a few mouse clicks. And so if you really enjoyed this episode, again, share this out with someone who could benefit from Dr. Carol's wealth of knowledge. And I wish you all the best. And until next time, happy self-marketing.